Hello and welcome to the Online Fundamentals webinar, and today we're going to be covering Windows 10 management with Workspace One. And what I want to do first is paint a little bit of a picture about why modern management and why Workspace One is so powerful when it comes to managing Windows 10. So first of all, I want you to think back about 10 to 12 years, so 2007 and before, and think about what the digital an average enterprise digital ecosystem strategy would have been. And I think for pretty much every organization, it would have been this. It would have been Windows. Everything to do with ecosystems, everything to do with end user computing was probably going to be Windows based and Win32 based. In 2007, that started to change, and the reason was that a little company called Apple released quite an interesting device, and this device started to change the end-user computing landscape. And it wasn't necessarily that Apple had released a new device that made the big difference. It's what they did with this device that made everything change for enterprises and consumers in EUC, because what they did is they made users and they made consumers change their requirements and change their expectations when it came to getting applications and when it came to using devices and where they could use devices. So rather than users being content with having a PC, so coming into the office, sitting down at a desk, and then turning on their computer, logging in, and then using that machine from 9 till 5, and then leaving and never thinking about work again, from then on, users wanted to be able to work anywhere, so on any device and across any ecosystem. And that kicked off the consumerization trend, and it kicked off a big change in IT, in enterprise IT, and across end user computing. The big problem with this, though, has always been that fantastic. iOS, Apple, Android, it was a new way of working, a new paradigm, a new model. But the problem is that Windows was still stuck in a really old way of operating. And what that old way of operating looked like would be using a lot of traditional PC lifecycle management tools to be able to manage Windows. So that's sort of tools like group policy, it's Active Directory, it's WSUS, it's potentially SCCM. And all these clunky old tools were there to get around the fact that Windows was never really designed to be a centrally managed platform. It has a long history that goes all the way back to 1985. And in all those years of evolution, up until Windows 10, Microsoft had never really designed Windows to be a centrally managed platform. And this is important because when it comes to managing Windows, it is a completely different way of doing things compared to the modern paradigm you have with enterprise mobility management you see across modern platforms like iOS and like Android. And when you think about what it takes to manage a machine, it's quite easy to get stuck in the mindset that buying a PC is actually potentially quite a cheap thing to do. And a lot of organizations just look at the initial cost of the PC and don't factor in all the other tools you'd have to manage Windows, to manage applications, to do the PC lifecycle management, to do the application lifecycle management, to update applications, update the operating system, secure the operating system. And that means that in a lot of organizations, we see this dichotomy between the new way of doing things and the Windows way of doing things. You'll have a desktop team and you'll have a mobile team. And that's because these two worlds have been seen to be very much different. Even though you may be delivering these services to a consistent group of users, it's seen that you need to do things completely differently for the desktop world and completely different for the mobile world. And that leads to increased cost. That means that across all these different devices, all these different tools, you'll have different platforms managing them, which means you potentially get compromised security. And if you have different ways of doing things, if your end users have different experiences and inconsistent experiences across those ecosystems, then that means that potentially their user experience, or not potentially, definitely their user experience will be compromised. Now, when it comes to IT in this scenario, then IT are usually measured on three key metrics. There's obviously the IT spend. If you're spending a lot of IT budget on a whole range of different tools, then you're not spending your money efficiently. And if you are not securing everything that you are doing, bearing in mind the huge fines we've seen recently for data breaches across a range of different organizations, then you're going to be in trouble. And in user experience, because I can guarantee if user experience isn't great across all these different devices, then you're going to get those users complaining. So as an IT team, you need to be on top of all three of these separate metrics. And when you have multiple platforms, that gets very, very difficult to do. And this is why VMware created Workspace One. So Workspace One is that unified platform for managing every single device that you have in the organization. So whether or not it's iOS or Android or Windows 10 or Mac OS or Chrome OS, whether or not you're using Win32 applications or modern Windows applications or SaaS applications or applications from public app stores for mobility, Workspace One has been built to manage all of those different variables. So all of the different ecosystems you have in enterprises, all of the different application ecosystems, all of the different types of users have been kept in mind when Workspace One was designed. And part of the problem we have is the fact that it's no longer a mono ecosystem environment out there. It is Windows plus every other ecosystem. And over the next 5 to 10 years, we will probably see Win32 applications become much less important to every ecosystem out there, and SaaS applications probably becoming much more important. But you still have this problem of, I've got all these different ecosystems, how do I manage them? And again, this comes back to the idea of having siloed teams. If you could break down these teams and cater for all of them from a single platform, then that would be absolutely fantastic. Still, most of the endpoints in pretty much every enterprise, every organization are going to be Windows-based, and there's very little variability from that norm. There may well be a lot of mobile devices, but in most cases, a large majority of that work is carried out on Windows devices. So you need a way of being able to manage those Windows devices. If you remember what VMware end-user computing is sort of famous for, then you may think of technologies like AirWatch. And for the past probably 10 years or so, enterprise mobility management has been one of the big trends in end-user computing. And enterprise mobility management, or EMM, is all about application and policy management and out-of-box provisioning for Android and iOS. And that's where its focus was, and it was very, very successful, and still very successful, because every organization will have, most organizations will have Android and iOS applications that need to be secured, and devices that need to be controlled, devices that need to be located, devices that need to be wiped potentially or secured in a different way. And that's why EMM has been such a huge trend in end-user computing for the past 10 years or so. Several years ago, a new trend started to emerge, and that was driven by the fact that you had this dichotomy between desktop class operating systems and mobile operating systems. So for the past few years, the really big trend in end-user computing has been for unified endpoint management. So that's taking the same capabilities you had for Android and iOS and extending them to desktop class operating systems. So the likes of Windows 10, Mac OS and Chrome. And the idea behind this, and behind what VMware does with Workspace One, is to give you a platform where you can manage each of these different ecosystems. So a unified platform for managing each of those different ecosystems. And the idea behind it is that you can, from this one platform, from the one console, you can create, as easily as you create a policy for iOS or Android, you can create a policy for Windows 10, for Mac OS, for Chrome OS. You have the ability to treat every device as if it's a modern device, because these days modern operating systems have the ability to be controlled using APIs. And this is the key difference between what Windows 10 does and what earlier versions of Windows does. So Windows 10 has been built to be API managed. Now you can still use some of the older PCLM technologies to manage Windows 10. So you can still use technologies such as SECM and WSUS, group policy. You can join these machines to the domain and manage them, script them in the traditional way. But the argument's got to be, why would you when you can now manage Windows 10 as if it's a mobile operating system, especially when you have a platform like Workspace One that will manage all of your devices in the same way. It makes sense to start managing Windows 10 as a mobile operating system using APIs. So if we were to look at the traditional model, and we'll go into this in a bit more detail a little bit later on, but if we were to look at the traditional model of deploying Windows or doing lifecycle management on a Windows desktop, then when you first deploy the image, that's potentially high touch. And again, we will come back to this, but creating the corporate image, deploying the corporate image can be quite a time-consuming and costly endeavor. Then you've got to configure it. In all likelihood, you're going to be using group policy. So you have to have that machine on the domain. And most of the time when you've got the machine on the domain, you need to have it connected to your network. Now, that could potentially be wide area network. It could be VPN, but you need to have that machine connecting back into your network so it gets access to the domain to get all of its group policies and all of its configurations. And then the same with patching. A lot of organizations are quite reticent to patch because every time you apply a patch to your end user computer in the estate, or any patch, or any estate really, you need to do your QA testing on it. You need to make sure that any patch or any update you're providing doesn't break user experience and user interactivity. And then pushing down application updates, which obviously is incredibly resource intensive. And then all of that is sort of secondary to security, and patches and application management feeds into security, but you still need to secure these endpoints. You need threat detection, you need antivirus, you need firewalls, and all of these different pieces have been controlled with a whole range of different tools and different PCLM tools. But in the new world, in the API-driven world, then instead of seeing all of these high-touch, resource-intensive ways of deploying and managing Windows, you have a new way of doing it. So potentially out-of-box enrollment, configuration pushed out over the air that doesn't necessarily need to be on your network. The ability to push out updates directly from the cloud, to push out applications directly from a platform, from a unified platform, and then real-time compliance checks against these endpoint devices, against Windows 10, to make sure that only compliant devices can get access to information and services and data that is within your data center. And that is why moving to the API-driven world of Windows 10 makes so much sense. And that is why when it comes to managing your entire fleet or swarm of devices in the organization, Workspace One makes so much sense. So if we were to have a look at the type of capabilities we're talking about, so EMM or UEM capabilities against Windows 10, then a lot of solutions out there will just focus on the traditional MDM type capabilities. So that's the ability to maybe set a passcode or push down some updates. But the argument would be that UEM goes so much further than this. So if you want to do modern onboarding, it's not necessarily just out-of-box enrollment. Depending on your users, depending on the devices, depending on how you procure those devices, you may want to do onboarding of devices in completely different ways. You may want factory provisioning rather than user provisioning. And this is where a platform like Workspace One will give you the ability to do complete end-to-end provisioning and lifecycle management across any of your different use cases. And also with Workspace One, we have the ability to pull out a lot of information about what your devices are doing, contextual information. We can pull out powerful insights based on all the information that we're aggregating into this central platform. We have the ability to enable users to have self-service. They can provision their own applications, to be able to provision their own Win32 applications directly from the portal. So from the same portal, they're seeing all of their SaaS applications and maybe all their virtual Windows apps and desktops. They can also provision Win32 applications. So we're taking what the capabilities that Windows has and extending them past MDM into the world of UEM, Unified Endpoint Management. And just as a sort of a quick snapshot of the capabilities that we have, so it could be for provisioning, it could be out-of-box enrollment or autopilot. It could be working with Dell to provision in factory. It could be having a look across your entire Windows 10 estate to find out the patch status and then automatically remediate every Windows 10 device that doesn't have the particular patches that your security department mandates. It could be setting contextual access policies for each application. And just as a really simple way of scanning all of these different capabilities, this is a sort of an EMM chart for Windows 10, and each of these different capabilities that you see, Workspace One can plug into and control, from Win32, native Win32 application deployment and lifecycle management, through to integration with Windows information protection, through to deploying group policies to devices, whether those devices are on or off the domain. And it's worth bearing in mind that when you go from a traditional PCLM type ecosystem to an API-driven mobile type model, then the costs associated with that decrease. So with Workspace One and the cloud-based platform, the infrastructure cost decreases because you have a lot of self-service and automation built into the platform. Then the help desk cost and the help desk time goes down. The whole range of different technology sets you'd have to have in place. So maybe MDM for mobile and a PCLM tool for Windows, or potentially an identity aggregation platform. All of this comes together into Workspace One and means that you can start to shrink those costs compared to a traditional PCLM tool. And it's not just VMware who recognizes how powerful Workspace One can be. So when it comes to unified endpoint management, we are recognized as being a leader in that type of market. And then when it comes to UEM across all of the different analysts, then Gartner, IDC, EMM, UEM capabilities, we're seeing as being the leader, the number one when it comes to UEM and when it comes to PC lifecycle management. So how can you take every Windows 10 PC that you have and start to manage it in a much more efficient way? Well, this is where I sort of called out earlier that we'd look into in a little bit more detail. So if you think about the traditional way of deploying a PC, even if it's a brand new Windows 10 machine that you've just got from the vendor. So let's say you get a brand new Windows 10 laptop or desktop PC. The first thing that 99% of all organizations will do is they will stick their own corporate image on top of that. So even though the machine comes with Windows 10 built into it, OEM Windows 10 built in and probably optimized for the hardware, most organizations will then stick their own corporate image on top of that. And it's taken them time to build that corporate image, and that corporate image needs to be updated. That's then put on top. Then company required applications, so default applications or all user applications, maybe Microsoft Office, are then put on top of that. And then depending on who the end users are going to be, they'll then get their own specific departmental applications put on. Then all the policies, all the settings, the desktop background, security, antivirus, etc., are all put onto that machine. It's a very high-touch way of delivering service. And if you think about that compared to what you do with something like an iPhone is very much, here you go, enroll, it's done. And so this is where you can start to see that big difference between the old way, the old PCLM way of managing Windows and desktops compared to the modern way. That doesn't have to be the case, though, with Windows 10 and API-driven management, because with Windows 10, Microsoft themselves say, look, you've already got a perfectly good image on that machine. Don't re-image it. Don't put your own image over the top. Just, in this case, use Workspace One, enroll the device, and then have all of those configuration policies pushed out over the air to that device. And that means that that device can be, instead of creating this image and then going through the imaging process, maybe pixie booting the machine, you just simply have the machine log on, and then all those configuration policies will be pushed out to it. So that machine becomes a corporate device. And this is incredibly powerful. And I'll show you what this looks like in a bit more detail shortly. And then when it comes to PC setup, when you think about what that looks like from an IT perspective, and obviously we've just been through this, then potentially there are multiple steps, some which the IT team may do, some of which are done at the factory. When it comes to modern PC deployment, then depending on your hardware vendor, obviously in this case the example is Dell, then you could have everything deployed and set up for that end user in the factory, which means from a provisioning perspective, IT just don't need to be involved. So what does that actually look like? Well, you can see here in this demo that this is a completely new Windows 10 machine, completely out of the box. And in this case, the user can select to join Azure Active Directory. They'll type in their email address. This user, strangely enough, is called Peter Parker at Web Enterprises. And what will happen is Azure will know that Workspace One is managing this domain. So it will ping the user across to authenticate against Web Enterprises, which is Workspace One. Workspace One will then see the device and then start to enroll it and push out all of its all the policies and settings and configs. So what you can see here is this device has now been enrolled and it is now being configured on the fly. So local applications will be deployed to it. Local Win32 applications will be deployed. Other policies, security policies will be deployed. Because we use content delivery networks, these configs and these applications will be deployed in a really efficient manner. You can also allow the user to install their own application. So here, the user's gone into Workspace One, gone into the application catalog, selected Visio, and then selected to install that. So that Win32 application will then be installed on that desktop natively. Every other setting that you'd want to have in here, so it could be calendaring, it could be the native email, can all be configured through Workspace One, Workspace One policies. Updates is another critical capability of the platform. So potentially using intelligence, you can detect whether or not the device has got the latest updates, and based on that, it'll send an email out to the end user and say, look, you need to have this Windows 10 update. It will then automate the install of that update. So you can be sure that all of your Windows 10 devices are completely compliant. And you can also choose and decide which updates go to which group of users and which devices. So you're in complete control of the Windows update process. And again, this takes away the requirement to have multiple different tools for pushing out updates, for pushing out policies, for pushing out compliance policies, and for delivering applications. And the same platform that you're using to do this, Workspace One, you can do the same thing on iOS, you can do the same thing on Mac OS, same thing on Chrome OS, the same thing on Android. So you're not using multiple tools to provide service to all of these different applications and ecosystems. So if you were to look at what this could potentially look like, so when it comes to onboarding, you have a whole different range of options to onboard the machines. They can come straight from the factory, already set up and ready to go to the end user. It could be set up by IT, so it could be the normal IT image-based staged deployment. It could be a managed machine on the domain, or it could be user-driven. So as you've just seen in that demonstration, the user could just simply log on and do out-of-box enrollment. And if you allow them to, they could potentially do that from anywhere. So this is useful if you have executives or important users in the organization who maybe lose their laptop and need to get access straight away. You could just allow them to go and buy a Windows 10 device and then do their own provisioning of that simply by logging in using their username, their AD username and password, which is incredibly powerful. Now, when it comes to pushing out these policies, obviously, if you've already got a lot of group policies or configurations set up in the old world, it can be potentially quite time-consuming to move these all over to an API-driven way of doing things, which is why we give you the ability to use baselines. So you can use Windows baselines, or you can use CIS benchmark baselines, and you can take these baselines and import them into Workspace One and use them to inform and create all of your security and configuration templates, which means if you conform or if you decide to follow a particular baseline, instead of going in and changing all those settings yourself, you can actually subscribe to these particular baselines. You can choose which release of Windows you want to deploy them to, and then you can then choose which groups of users these particular baselines apply to. And it's the way we have of simplifying deployment and simplifying configuration of Windows 10. And because Workspace One is primarily cloud-based, it means that you can push out all of these different policies and different settings to Windows 10 from the cloud. So even if you have a Win32 application that you want to push out, you can simply upload that to Workspace One and then push that out. And even if you want to do something that's quite deep within the hardware. So in this case, if you have a Dell PC estate, you can actually control the BIOS settings directly from Workspace One and directly from the cloud. So you simply go in, put in your configurations, decide on your compliance policies, put in which applications, either from public app stores or applications that you're going to push out yourself, and then push them all out from the cloud-based platform. So a core part of what we do with Workspace One is actually Workspace One Intelligence. And if you think about where Workspace One sits when it comes to the device estate, it sits right in the middle. So if you are using this strategically to manage all of your different devices and all of your applications and all of your SaaS application access, then Workspace ONE is in a unique position to be able to grab information from each of those devices and each of those users. It means we can pull information out of device logs. We can pull out device logs. We can pull out application information. We can see how your users are using certain applications. We can see when they're authenticating, where they're authenticating from. We can see what device platform they're on, and we can aggregate all this information together and give you the ability to report against it. And what that means is if you do have a set of Windows 10, let's say the Windows 10 laptops that don't come into the organization very often, you can decide when they get updated. And if they're not updated, you can find out through intelligence. Workspace ONE Intelligence will tell you which machines are not updated. It will then automate the deployment of those updates to those machines to make sure they're always compliant. If they're not compliant, then you can prevent those machines from getting access to back-end applications and services. So if we were to illustrate this, in this case, if you're using intelligence, you can detect particular security vulnerabilities or subscribe to common vulnerability database and pull down that information. You can then check your machines to make sure they have a patch level, which will make sure the exploits that make sure the machine isn't vulnerable to that exploit, deploy the patch, and then move the machine back into a compliant mode so it can now access all of the services and all of the applications that you make available to them. So when it comes to applications, because we can deploy applications across absolutely every ecosystem we tend to see in enterprises, and we can do the same thing with Windows, it means that your users have a really consistent experience. So from Workspace ONE, once they have their device and you're managing their device from Workspace ONE, they can access Win32 applications, or you can give them access to cloud applications, or you can give them access, potentially lockdown access to store applications. You can decide through our integration with Windows App Locker which applications are whitelisted, which are blacklisted. So you have full control over the application estate that your end users are using. And then using intelligence, you can go in, you can dive in, and you can deep dive into individual devices. You can have an overview of which of your devices are currently enrolled, which ones have the updates. You can have a look at applications as well. You can have a look at application launches. You can see one of the key issues we've tended to see in the past is that when you roll out a new application to a group of users, you would like to know how widely used that application is. You'd like to know application adoption, and you can see that through this platform because with intelligence we have that visibility because of the unique location and the unique place that Workspace ONE has as a platform in the organization. So you have end-to-end visibility, so end-to-end security and end-to-end visibility. So when it comes to logging onto the device in the first place, you can integrate with biometric capabilities. You can protect the endpoint. You can integrate with DLP technologies, Windows Information Protection, or Graph for Windows applications on mobile devices. And you can also secure the network. So using our tunnel type capability, you can launch an application and make sure that application only has access to the services it needs to have in the data center. So you are protecting your end user computing estate at every stage from every attack vector. One of the other capabilities we've recently built into the platform is the ability to lock your PC to only give access to IT approved applications, and we call this device guard. So what you want to make sure of is that only applications that IT has approved can be installed on that machine. A lot of vulnerabilities could potentially come from applications that have been installed from the internet or applications that have been installed from untrusted sources. And then using Workspace ONE, we have the ability to make sure that you are completely in control of which Win32 applications are installed. So when it comes to the full end-to-end capabilities we have in Workspace ONE, we are seen to be best in class when it comes to the likes of iOS and Android for traditional EMM type capabilities. And then when it comes to desktop operating systems, Windows 10, and it's not just MDM, it's not just the traditional MDM APIs that we have control of, but the ability to supplant PCLM tools for Windows 10 to do policy deployment, patch deployment, software lifecycle management, and to be absolutely on top of security and visibility of your estate from end to end. And we can do something, we can do the same thing with Mac OS. So the ability to manage Mac OS is built into the platform. And the same when it comes to Chrome OS. So we have a fantastic partnership with Google, which means that we have really, really great access to Chrome OS APIs, because we're no longer in a single ecosystem world. It's no longer just about Windows. It's about pretty much every other ecosystem that your organization wants to use, and you've got to be reactive to that. But building on top of a platform like Workspace One gives you that capability. And then when it comes to non-traditional endpoints, you have the ability to manage rugged devices, so barcode scanners, etc., wearable devices, kiosks, IoT. All of this is built into the Workspace One platform. So if there's anything else you want to know when it comes to Workspace One and its capabilities, especially its capabilities around Windows 10, then feel free to check out these resources. I'd suggest that Hands-On Labs is a great resource to use. So there's plenty of end-user computing labs in there. So if there's any particular facet of Workspace One you want to have a play with, then go and have a look at Hands-On Labs. There's a couple there that could start you off: Unified Endpoint Management for Windows 10, and then getting started with UEM. Right, thank you for your time. Are there any questions?